Ok, buenos días. Muchas gracias por asistir a esta presentación. Es un agrado presentarles a la doctora Sharon Robinson. Ella es académica de la Universidad de Wollongong. Es una académica muy destacada en cambio climático, en estudios de cambio climático. Forma parte del panel que hace predicciones periódicamente sobre el estado del planeta. Y hoy nos va a presentar un tema bastante novedoso, que es el efecto que tienen los incendios forestales y los volcanes sobre la capa de ozono. A nivel tal vez común, todos creíamos que el agujero de ozono se había recuperado, ¿ya? Y estábamos tranquilos. Yo los últimos 2 o 3 años que estaba en la Antártica pensaba que ya no era un problema. Sin embargo, desde el año 2021 a la fecha se ha empezado a aumentar el agujero y está en niveles tal vez superiores a los que estuvo en la época más compleja. Sharon entonces se ha preocupado de este tema. Ella acaba de volver de un viaje que estuvo durante un mes en la Antártica con alrededor de 100 mujeres destacadas en diversos ámbitos que son seleccionadas para viajar. Así que vio in situ probablemente the effect of the ozone hole in Antarctica. Okay. Gracias, Sharon. Thank you very much for sharing with us your presentation.
Hola, thank you for coming this morning, and it's really nice to be back at USASH and to be visiting with Gustavo and to be able to talk to you today about how the ozone hole is repairing, but also some of the challenges that it faces. And so I'm actually at a university in Australia in a place called Wollongong, which is just below Sydney. So here's the map of Australia. It's here on the coast. And I just put this image up to show you that it's a very nice space if anyone wants to come visit. So this is the town. The university is over here, and we're very close to the beach, and there's lots of swimming pools and surfing. And the university is situated on Dharawal country, so that's the indigenous people that live in the area are part of the Dharawal group of people. So that's the country, the name that they give to the country that the university is on. But Wollongong is actually also an Aboriginal name. And what I'm going to talk to you today is about UV radiation in Antarctica. And when I was talking with Gustavo about this, one of the questions that we often get asked is, but I thought the ozone hole was already fixed. So when you say you're going to give a talk on this, people go, but isn't it already fixed? So I will address that as I go through my talk. But I'm going to talk about the Antarctic ozone hole. Is UV really a problem for Antarctic organisms? Has the Montreal Protocol been successful, the treaty that is helping to repair the ozone hole? Why is ozone depletion still happening? Why is timing of ozone depletion critical for the organisms, the animals and plants that live in Antarctica? And what does this mean for the marine and terrestrial animals, the animals and plants that are in Antarctica? And this is hopefully this movie will work. Okay, so this is last year's ozone hole over Antarctica. So yes, there is still an ozone hole here. And if you watch here, you can see that there's actually ozone depletion over South America. So over Chile and Argentina, especially in the Patagonian region, you can see when it's blue, that means there's actually quite low levels of ozone protecting places like Patagonia during the spring months. And so ozone depletion is still happening, but I will talk about how the Montreal Protocol has been successful in major part. And just to explain these maps, this is the scale, hopefully you can see it, but basically we say it's an ozone hole if there's less than 220 Dobson units of ozone. So this is how deep is that column of ozone? And if it's 220 Dobson units or less, we say it's an ozone hole. And so dark blue is an ozone hole, and light blue is only just a little bit above that. And we know that that indicates that the ozone layer has actually been depleted. And we know that before humans started putting CFCs into the atmosphere, into the stratosphere, the atmosphere and the stratosphere, we didn't see levels as low as that. So a level below 220 is a human effect on ozone. And this is the ozone hole's progression since 1979, when we first noticed that this was happening, through to 2022. I haven't put up 2023 because we haven't got to New Year's, we haven't got to the end of the year yet. But I will talk a little bit about the last few years, but just to note that ozone depletion increased. And because of that, humans got an international treaty, the Montreal Protocol, which reduced and stopped the levels of the ozone depleting chemicals, the chemicals that we were putting into the atmosphere, which were mainly refrigerants and spray accelerants and things like that. So we reduced a number of those chemicals going into the atmosphere as a result of the Montreal Protocol. And so we are repairing the ozone layer, but we don't expect that it will be fully repaired until 2065. So it's a long, so even though the Montreal Protocol was signed in the 1980s and we have been reducing those compounds, it's an indication of how long the lag is when we change something in the Earth's climate. So when we think about climate change and increasing greenhouse gases, even if we stop now, the heating in the atmosphere will continue for probably many decades, because there's an inertia, there's a lag between when you stop producing the compound and the effects actually being felt of it. And this is certainly true with ozone depletion, because we can see that the ozone hole has increased. And I will talk a little bit about why we know it's actually the Montreal Protocol is working, but you can see that there are 3 very large ozone holes down here. So this is 1st of October 2023. I chose this one because it actually does show some depletion up over Patagonia. But this is the size of the ozone hole. So this is in millions of kilometers. And you can see that the ozone hole is as big as Antarctica. The largest it's ever been is 27 million kilometers squared, which is a very large area. I don't know how many football pitches that is, but it's big. The largest ozone hole was in 2006. There's been some quite small ones, but the last 4, including 2023, because they've already said that the ozone hole for this year is large, the last 4 have been quite large. You can see that they're all over 20 million of kilometers in size, kilometers squared in size. And this is the minimum ozone. So the minimum ever reached was in 1994, a value of 92 Dobson units. For 2023, the minimum was 115. And so these levels are all quite low and indicating quite severe ozone depletion. And why is this important? Because we know that the ozone layer protects us from ultraviolet radiation. So what ozone does is it reduces the level of UV that comes through to Earth. And that's important because if we have too much UV, we know we get skin cancer, and we know that there are effects on eyes and other effects on humans and other animals and plants. And this graph, I think, is really interesting. This came out in a paper from the United Nations Environment Panel last year. And these are our colleagues, Roy McKenzie, who's here, and I are on writing these United Nations Environment Panel papers. But this is the first one which looks at how much has the ozone hole affected the UV that we see on Earth. So it's looking at what that effect of ozone depletion is. And this data is really interesting because we have the maximum UV index, and this is the southern hemisphere months, and these are the northern hemisphere months. So they're basically lined up so that the summer is here, whether it's winter, spring, summer, autumn. Some of these two places are in the northern hemisphere, so that's that axis, and the green one is the southern hemisphere for Antarctica. And is everyone familiar with the UV index? So when you get an app on your phone which says the UV index is 10 or 11, then you would definitely want to be putting on sunscreen, maybe staying inside. It's an easy, it's been designed for people to make sure they don't get sunburned, basically. But anything over 11 is considered an extreme UV index. Okay, so the first place I'm going to show you is San Diego in California, which is pretty much at the same latitude in the northern hemisphere as Santiago is in the south. Okay, so probably the UV here is very similar to this, and because it's because of the location close to the equator, the UV goes up very high from winter into summer, and you get UV index levels of about 12. And this would probably be similar to what you would experience in Santiago in the summer. You may or may not be able to see that there are actually two lines here. One of these is the levels between 1970 and 76. And the other one is what's happened in the last 20 years, in the 21st century. And for San Diego, the ozone depletion hasn't really made very much difference. So the yellow, if you can see yellow in the middle there, the little bit of yellow shows the difference between when we had no ozone depletion and now when we have ozone depletion, or when we had peak ozone depletion. You can see in San Diego, it doesn't really make a particularly significant difference. The second one I'm going to show you is in Alaska. So this is in the Arctic at 71 degrees north. And this is the blue line down here. And so you can see here that there's a little bit more difference between the 1970s, the pre-ozone depletion time, and ozone depletion now. And there's a little bit, so this yellow area is the bit that's affected by ozone depletion. But we don't see an Arctic ozone hole to the same extent as the Antarctic one. And so the final one is Palmer Station, which is on the peninsula. I think Gustavo has visited. I was there 2 weeks ago, so I've now visited there. But in Antarctica, you can see this massive difference. So this is what it was like before ozone depletion, and all this yellow area shows how much the ozone hole has made the UV index bigger as a result of ozone depletion. And if you look at this line, you can see that also the UV gets very, very high in the spring. And so this is ozone depletion going up. We get levels of 14 in spring, and even in early summer, we're still getting levels of 8, which is quite high. And you can see the difference, how much different it has become. So back before ozone depletion, the UV index was hardly ever over 6, and now it can be 14. So this is the maximum level, but it's still a very large jump. It's more than doubled. And one of the things that I'm really worried about this is I've been working on UV effects on plants for a very long time, like Gustavo has as well. But one of the things with ozone depletion is it happens early in the season when a lot of stuff is under snow. So it probably has we thought it would have much less effect because it's too early in the season, everything's under snow, everything's dormant. Maybe it's not such a big problem. But when you see these levels of UV very late in the spring and early summer, that's when the biology is starting to happen and the snow is melting. So I'm very much more concerned about high UV levels here than if they were back in September. And that's what I'm really going to talk a bit more about later. So if we look back at the progression of ozone depletion, the other thing I'm going to talk about is why were these 3 years, and now we have 2023, it's actually also large, why were they so big? because isn't the Montreal Protocol working? What's going on? So I'll talk a little bit about the Montreal Protocol. It was actually adopted in September 87, and to date, it's one of the rare treaties that the United Nations has brought into effect that is signed by every single country in the world. So when South Sudan became a new country, they signed the Montreal Protocol. Everyone has signed it. So it's very, very successful. That's very rare for any treaty, any international treaty. And what it has done is it has actually meant that the level of ozone depletion is starting to stabilize, and actually the ozone layer is getting deeper again. So if you look at the yellowy gold line, that's September. This is ozone depletion because of all the CFCs and the compounds that we were putting into the atmosphere and stratosphere. And it levels off here. And actually there is an increase, and it's a significant increase over this time, which is showing some recovery in ozone depletion. So yes, we can say the Montreal Protocol is a very successful treaty. The blue line is October. The October line is probably still flat. So it's only just starting to have an effect. The other thing that's really important about the Montreal Protocol, and why I said it's such an effective environmental treaty, is because ozone depleting substances, so this is what the Montreal Protocol calls them. So the CFCs that we put into the stratosphere are called ozone depleting substances. So I'm going to call them ODS for short, okay? Many of those are potent greenhouse gases. So in addition to breaking down ozone in the stratosphere, they contribute to global warming. As a result of the Montreal Protocol, we've reduced the emissions of those over the last 20 years. And these reductions do two things. They protect the ozone layer, and they've reduced humans' contribution to climate change. And without the Montreal Protocol, we think the warming due to those ozone depleting compounds, if we hadn't stopped making them, the ozone layer would be much, much more reduced, but also we would have 3 times as much greenhouse gas warming, three times as much global warming. So that's a major achievement. And in addition to that, one of the subsequent amendments to the Montreal Protocol has actually helped to reduce the greenhouse gas warming, greenhouse gas emissions and greenhouse gas warming even more. So what the Montreal Protocol did was it phased out these chlorofluorocarbons, the CFCs. It temporarily replaced them with hydrochlorofluorocarbons, which are HCFCs. But then we realized that those were greenhouse gases. And so what it's done since is to phase out these HCFCs. And so we went from CFCs, we went from CFCs to HCFCs and then to HFCs. And this expanded use of these compounds was fine as far as the Montreal Protocol was concerned, because they're not ozone depleting. So this was, as far as the Montreal Protocol was concerned, that was all that had to happen. But then we realized that these HFCs are greenhouse gases. And so they were contributing to climate change. And so in 2016, the Kigali Amendment was signed, and that extends climate protection. So by reducing these compounds, HFCs, so saying we can't replace these other compounds with HFCs, we have to find ozone compounds that don't deplete ozone, but also don't deplete, don't increase global warming. So there are things that we've banned. The Kigali Amendment bans those things that deplete ozone, but still contribute to global warming. And it's projected that we've avoided 0.3 to 0.5 degrees of centigrade of warming because of the phase out of these various ozone depleting compounds and their replacements. And it's the first time the Montreal Protocol was enacted or amended to prevent global warming. And so actually, if you think about what the leaders at the moment who are at COP28, what we're trying to do is agree a legally binding commitment to greenhouse gas reductions. And we still haven't really managed to do that. The Montreal Protocol is actually enforced, so countries don't emit more CFCs, but we're still struggling to do that same thing with greenhouse gases. And so it's interesting that this is the reason the Montreal Protocol is so successful is because it's both protecting the ozone layer, but also a very strong commitment to reducing those greenhouse gases. So it's done two things, and it's protecting the climate. So let's go back to those last 4 years and why have they been so big? So if we look at here's ozone depletion, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. It peaks in 2006. And then we thought it was going to be stable for a little while and then start to go down. And now we've had 4 years in a row with with a lot of ozone depletion, with a very big ozone hole. So I'm going to talk a bit more about that. And the other thing that's important about those last 4 years is that we've seen December and November. So November is in gray. This is ozone depletion, the ozone depth. We've seen the November and December levels become really low compared to previously. So this is the last 3 years, so up to 2022. We haven't got the full data for 2023 yet, but you can see that these levels are amongst for November, they're as low, and December, they're as low as they've been in the past. So we're still getting very large levels of ozone depletion in November and December. So what's going on? Why is the ozone hole still so big, and why is it extending into November and December? And the reason is that when in 2019-20 we had those massive fires in Australia, the smoke from these massive fire events, there was such a big pyrocumulus cloud produced that the aerosols from the smoke were injected into the stratosphere, and they actually acted to deplete ozone. And so climate change is making bushfires happen more often. We get droughts. It happens in Australia, it happens in Chile. This year we had bad fires in California in the summer, and Canada, which is another place that doesn't usually burn as much as that. Greece, Spain. So all around the world, we're getting more bushfires because climate change makes it hotter, and there's more drought, and there's more bushfires because there's more, the conditions are right for fires. And when we do that, we're injecting, if the fire is big enough, we're injecting compounds into the stratosphere that can deplete ozone. So that was 2019-20. The effect of that was mostly felt the year after, but there was depletion. There was depletion across the latitudes that Australia is in. There was depletion of ozone for many months into 2020. While we were all in lockdown with the COVID pandemic. And then in addition, and this is completely natural, there's not much we can do about volcanoes, probably nothing, but when a volcanic eruption happens, the same thing, we get injection of compounds into the stratosphere, which can also break down ozone. And we've had a number of quite large eruptions of volcanoes over the last a few years. So we had the bushfires, that was the first year, and then we had a few volcanoes that have depleted ozone. And this is this year, so 2023. So we haven't got all the data, so it hasn't been on the other graphs, but what happened this year was Early in the season, we actually got quite a lot of ozone depletion. This is the ozone hole area from July through to December. And early in the season, it actually opened early. This is the mean for the 79 years from 79. So this is 79 to the 1990s. Ozone depletion started earlier. It got quite high, and then it closed up a little bit. But even here, this is November 30th, which is the last date, latest date that's available. Even in November, it's still much higher than the long-term mean that we've had for many years. So this means that it's extending, ozone depletion is extending into November and early December. And that was what I was talking about at the beginning, saying that's when the organisms that are in Antarctica are going to be actually active. So it's much more concerning to have a late ozone depletion late in the season or late in the spring than an early summer, than it is to have it way back here in September. The reason this opened up early is probably because of the big volcano that erupted in the Pacific, which was that underwater volcano. And it's interesting because that was mostly putting water vapor into the stratosphere. So even that had an effect on ozone depletion. So this is what 2022 looked like. It wasn't as early as this year, so ozone depletion went up really rapidly towards the end of August and early September. It reached a maximum of 26 million kilometers squared in October. And then you would expect it to come down. The highest levels for most of the period for the ozone hole, the highest levels of ozone depletion are usually late September, early October, but you can see that it's extending right out here to middle of November and into December. And so this is what I'm concerned about, because I think we've been studying what happens here, and now it's all shifted to what happens here when the biology is actually probably going to be worried about it. And some of this is in an editorial that I wrote for Antarctic Science in May this year. The other thing that's been happening in Antarctica, and I'm sure you would have seen some news, I should have tried to find some in Spanish, but this is the reports that came out a few months ago, which were reporting that sea ice was really low this summer, particularly low. It's been declining, the Antarctic sea ice, since 2016, but this year was very, very low in the middle, all through the summer, and then into the winter. The sea ice just didn't grow as big as it normally does. And then there were really distressing reports about the effect this was having on the emperor penguin chicks. So these very cute, fluffy little animals are, when they first hatch, they have a fluffy coat, like a big duvet, a big bedspread, lots of feathers. So they can survive and huddle on the ice in the winter for many months without their parents. When their parents go off to feed, the chicks need to be able to keep warm. And so they have a down coat, but it's not waterproof. So if the sea ice breaks up too early, if the sea ice breaks up before December and early January, then the chicks end up in the water, and because they have no waterproof feathers, they drown or they freeze to death. So there was a report that said that of the 5 emperor penguin colonies that they had studied in 2022, so this is the last summer, not the one that we're in now, but the last summer, of those 5 colonies, 4 of them had no successful breeding. So the adults would have been okay, but none of the chicks survived. So thousands of chicks would have died in that summer because the sea ice broke up early. So that's not an ozone effect, but it illustrates the fact that there's many things changing in Antarctica. So we've got this increased UV because of the ozone hole, but we've also got very, very low levels of sea ice. So this is the mean level for sea ice for 1981 to 2010. The red line is what it was in 2022. So it was the lowest on record for some of that time. This is the 2023 level so far. And it's much, much lower than it was in previous years. So Antarctic sea ice is reducing. The same thing that's been happening in the Arctic for many decades is now starting to happen in the Antarctic. So what do these two things together mean for Antarctic organisms? When we think about the peak of ozone depletion, that used to coincide with the peak of sea ice. So if you were a marine organism, if you were an emperor penguin, it would be bad because you'd be on top of the ice. If you were a marine animal or plant, you'd be under the sea ice. So the sea ice would reflect the UV and it wouldn't really be a problem. But if you have an extended ozone hole, then you have increased UV here. When we saw those graphs, we saw the highest UV was at the end of November and early December. So in here, the sea ice is starting to decline. So there'll be much more ocean exposed with no sea ice on top to reflect the UV that would be so it can affect the animals in the water and the plants in the water. So if you're a marine organism, previously, if the peak of ozone was in September or October, if you were a penguin, wrong sort of penguin, but it's a cartoon penguin. So the emperors would have been on top of the ice. Some of the other penguins, like Adelies, would also be on top of the ice. But anything below the sea ice, any UV or radiation generally would be reflected by the sea ice back. So it doesn't really matter how high. This increase is probably not particularly relevant for marine animals, unless you're a penguin, in which case you probably need sunglasses, or a seal. But if we have ozone depletion in November and December, when we get these 14s in late November, the sea ice has melted. So the krill and the other animals that are in the water have to go below, have to be able to move away from the highest UV, go deeper in the water. But if you're at the surface, you're going to be getting more UV as a result of that increase in November and December. So I think it's much more relevant if we have ozone depletion later in the season. And this is an example of the difference that sea ice can make. This isn't actually to do with UV particularly, but if we look at this picture here, this is the sort of community that you get on the seabed if you have sea ice present for most of the summer. And you can see that there are sponges and there are all sorts of marine invertebrates that live. It's a very complicated, very complex, interesting, biodiverse environment on the seabed underneath the sea ice. If you remove the sea ice, algae can grow. And so what happens is this becomes replaced with an algal community because the algae have enough sunlight to photosynthesize for most of the summer. And so because of that change in sea ice, algae take over and they outcompete and smother the invertebrates that would have been there before. So it's really important how long the sea ice is there for those benthic communities. And these are a bit like the barrier reefs. They're very complex invertebrate communities with lots of biodiversity, so that's important to preserve. On the land, we have mosses and lichens and vascular plants that are also growing under that, would be growing on the land, but in September and October, they will be covered with snow. So they won't be being affected by high UV at that time of year. So this is supposed to be a sleepy moss plant. So it would have been covered by that snow and asleep, frozen, desiccated, very, very dormant. But in November and December, when we have the high UV levels, the snow will have melted, the mosses will all be exposed, they'll be photosynthesizing because they've got water, so they'll be active metabolically, All the microorganisms that are in the soil will also be photosynthetically active. The cyanobacteria that in the mosses are going to be photosynthetically active. But all of those organisms are going to then be exposed to that high level of UV radiation. So much more damaging than if it's early in the season. And these are just some of the effects that we know happen if the plants are exposed to UV. So many years ago, I did an experiment where we screened mosses, and we looked at what happened if you took out the UV and you reduced it down to low levels. And this is what moss looks like if you remove the UV. It has nice pointy shoots. The little leaflets are all happy and green. There's lots of chlorophyll. And this is what the same species looks like under normal UV. So this is just the natural levels of UV it was getting in the summer. I haven't given it any extra UV, but you can see that actually the leaves are not pointy. They're all deformed. There's some sort of structural problem happening, probably cellular damage that's affected how the leaves have grown. So these leaves don't look very healthy, and also much reduced chlorophyll. So not green, because they're producing more carotenoids, more stress response pigments to protect themselves, but less chlorophyll. The chlorophyll is being bleached, or maybe the plants aren't producing as much. I think it's probably actually bleaching. And this is what the leaves look like. This is an individual leaf under a confocal microscope. Each of those little red dots is a chloroplast. So chloroplasts should be red under this treatment. The light should enable them to fluoresce. And they should be little red dots, which is exactly what you have here. And you have many chloroplasts within each cell. But if you look over here at the ones that were growing with just the natural amounts of UV, the chloroplasts are yellow, which means they're not able to fluoresce as much. They're not as healthy. And there are many cells with no chloroplasts in, where the chloroplasts have actually been so badly damaged they've died. And this is probably why this plant is so yellow, because it's got many less chloroplasts, active chloroplasts. There's many cells with no photosynthetic apparatus inside them. So this is an endemic species, Schistinium antarcticae, which grows a lot on the continent, all around the continent, but you do get it on the peninsula. The two cosmopolitan species we looked at were a bit more resilient, but this just shows that the current levels of UV do impose a certain amount of stress on the plants and probably have a cost in terms of photoprotection. So the plants are happier if they have less UV than they're getting naturally at the moment under ozone depletion. And this experiment was done in the late 1990s. So it was when ozone depletion was quite high, but also when ozone depletion was mostly happening in September and October and not in November and December. And these plants would have been under snow until December. So they were really only getting UV in December, a bit of December, January, February. And Melinda, who has visited here many times and worked with Gustavo, has worked on some of the compounds that the plants produce to protect themselves. So this is Ceratodon purpureus, which goes red when it's in the sun. And we think this is a desiccation and UV stress compound. So this is exposed to light. And this is the same moss growing underneath a white rock. So in low light. So this is a natural UV exclusion experiment. And you can see that it's making a red pigment, which is in the cell walls, whereas the green one doesn't have those pigments. And this is a confocal microscope where we've stained that same pigment in the cell walls. You can see it in the cell walls, and here are the chloroplasts in the cells. So some of the mosses, this is another species to the one that I showed on the previous slide. This Ceratodon species is very tolerant. It has a lot of these cell wall compounds to protect itself. But we did all of these studies way back when most of the ozone depletion would have been here. And so we were probably studying levels of UV that would have been much lower, which would have probably been more like 8 to 10, not probably these 14s that we're seeing now in November, December. What we worked out when Kevin Newsham and I did a meta-analysis looking at all the UV experiments that have been done in the Arctic and the Antarctic. And we calculated that if you doubled the UV exposure, so if you go from 6 to 12, which is what we have done, then it would reduce the above ground biomass by about 20%, and it would increase the production of sunscreen compounds by about 5%. And we calculated that protection that the plants were doing for themselves, making for themselves, cost the plants about 6% of their annual carbon gain. But that was for these lower levels. And all the experiments have been done under probably at the wrong time of year for actual effects to be manifest in Antarctica. So it might be that we need to revisit some of these experiments. And this is a paper that has come out of the lab here at USACH, where Rodrigo and Marisol and Gustavo and others and Hans were working on photoprotective flavonoids. I just wanted to make the point that Colobanthus and Disjampsia, the two vascular plants, also produce sunscreen compounds and have antioxidant compounds to protect themselves. So I think the important thing is to understand what's the cost of that damage for marine and terrestrial organisms, and how much does it cost in terms of lost productivity for the plant. So how much does it reduce the growth? And we don't really know that for the marine organisms, I don't think. So we tend to think about a warming atmosphere, increased melt of the ice sheet, and increasing ocean temperature, but we largely avoid or ignore ultraviolet radiation in that context. And so for many of these organisms, we really don't know if they will be affected or are being affected by that higher UV in November and December. And so I think it's probably a good time to go back and look at those experiments and see if we can actually use, at least model what we think the effect of the increasing UV in November and December actually is. So my take-home messages are, we know that the Montreal Protocol has been successful. It is repairing the ozone layer, but that will probably not be fully repaired until 2065. And the problem is that some of the things that we're doing because of some of the things that are happening because of climate change might slow that down. So if we have many, many bushfires and lots of sulfates being injected into the atmosphere and going into the stratosphere, then we could delay that process. There are also conversations happening around geoengineering, which would mean putting more sulfates into the stratosphere to dim the planet in order to help to cool it. So you may have heard, how many people have heard of geoengineering? Is it a different word in Spanish?
No.
Yeah. So geoengineering would be if we decide we have to make a physical barrier. We have to put something up in the atmosphere to reflect so that the sun, not as much sunlight comes down and doesn't heat the globe so much. And one of those solutions would be sulfates, which we know in the stratosphere, which would deplete ozone more. So climate change is another factor in whether ozone recovery really happens. There's concern that wildfires exacerbated by climate change will delay ozone recovery. We can't do anything about volcanic eruptions. They will happen, but we can act on climate. We can potentially reduce the number of additional fires we get. And as biologists, I think it's, really important to look at how ozone depletion over Antarctica has been extended into November and December, and what that means for all the organisms that used to be protected by the snow and ice and probably aren't and are now getting much more UV than they used to. I should probably say, and this is the Antarctic Research Centre Securing Antarctica's Environmental Future. And one of the postcards we put, or one of the banners that we produced was this one where we don't want to watch unhappy feet. So I think particularly with the sea ice, the impacts on the penguins are particularly valid. And maybe we need to be making penguin sunglasses to make sure they don't get glaucomas and damage to their eyes as well. So I'd like to thank my colleagues on the unit panel, Roy and Laura Revel and Raquel Osala, and also Germar Bernard. He's the person who did the UV index measurements for Antarctica, which provoked all of this conversation. And this is just to thank the University of Wollongong, where I am, the Australian Antarctic Programme for getting us to Antarctica, as well as INASH, who have got us to the peninsula to do some of this work, and Gustavo here at the University at USASH. And we also have some colleagues in Spain at the University of the Balearic Islands who've been involved in some of this research. And SAFE's vision is an environmentally secure Antarctica valued for its role in the Earth system and its significance to society. And hopefully what I've been talking about is illustrating some of those things that as humans we're doing to the globe. And we've acted really well with the Montreal Protocol, and we're starting to repair ozone depletion. But if we don't take action on climate change, the Earth will get really too hot and we will have all sorts of environmental problems because of that. But also we might be making the ozone hole bigger again, which would be a really negative and backward step. So hopefully at COP this week, there will be some more progress and some more concrete action on climate change. And I'm very happy to answer any questions. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you, Sharon, for your very interesting talk. Now we have a question. You have one? Or you?
I do have one. Thank you so much. Really, really interesting. I'm impressed on the growth of the ozone layer depletion, and I have not been participating in these committees, but it seems to me that the actions that are being taken are really mild regarding particularly the contributions of companies and industry into the diminish of the chemicals that are contributing to this whole problem. So my question is, how COPE or other organizations are really imposing? I know that it's not the right word to impose or force industry to change several of the practices that we have been doing for many, many years. For example, I just would like to mention one thing. We know today, I work on extremophiles, we know today that in the case of chemicals that are used in many of the processes that from biotech all the way to chemical industry are being used, actually being used, we can transform them by use biochemicals where the waste of energy is much less, the contamination is reduced more than 50%. Where are these experts that can put a word and say and demonstrate that these things are happening and we can do something about it?
Yeah, I think I just agree with you. So I think we have probably all of the solutions that we need, both to reduce carbon in the atmosphere. We can use renewable energy. We have good battery technology that's developing now. It might be somewhat difficult to reorganize the grids, but I think we have examples that can happen. Yeah. So I don't actually feel that it's, I think we're in a good place to actually make that transition, but we have companies that are involved in fossil fuel area that don't want to give up their power in that space. And so, as you were saying, in terms of we have many sustainable solutions, but we really have to, I think people have to impress on their governments that we really need to take this action, because otherwise we have a planet that we can't live on. And the planet will survive. I think the problem is that it won't be very comfortable for us. It's not that so I'm not so worried that the planet won't survive, but I am worried that it won't be a very good home. And we really don't have a plan B. So it's our only home. And I think, I mean, you know, if you're a company and all you do is oil, it's a bit of a problem, because you need to transition into something else. But we have made these sorts of transitions many, many times. The Montreal Protocol is an example where the CFCs in the refrigerants were found to be damaging, but we now have other compounds that can do that same job, probably more efficiently. They're not greenhouse gases. And they, you know, we still have fridges, we have refrigeration, we have all of those, we have air conditioning units. So humans are amazingly resourceful, but I think it's about saying we need to take action now. We need to make this change, because if we don't, it will be very, very hard for all of us, but especially for young people and for the next generations. That's what I worry about. Yeah, and I think the work that you're doing, if we can make things in a biologically sustainable way and without chemicals, it's obviously much, much better, because there's also, you know, plastic pollution and chemical pollution, which microbes are probably our only chance of breaking down as well.
They are.
So good question.
Yeah.
You have? Yeah, okay.
Thank you very much, Sharon. I don't know if yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for sharing your experience with. So my question is about the species, the mosses species that are now in Antarctica. So they have been adapted for coping with these UV levels, no? Because of the 50 years of experience, could be? Or
I think probably I think they're probably only adapted to levels half as much as what they're getting now. So I do think that they are experiencing double that amount as a maximum, and the microbes and the algae and the lichens. And so, and it's in a relatively short time. So it's 20 to 40 years. They're not going to they haven't evolved under those conditions. Obviously mosses on Earth, the ancestors of all those plants would have had UV tolerance in order to make the transition from water to land. So there is an ability in most plants to protect from UV. So I think it's more about whether they have the ability to switch on those pathways, and what the cost is of making the compounds to protect themselves compared to what they lose in growth and productivity as a result. So I think, yeah.
So yes, but so my question was going to, could UV be driver of stopping species to get into Antarctica, but maybe not because of the explanation that you have. So could be that reducing the UV because of the recovery of the ozone hole allow more species to come in, or it will be nothing to do with this?
It's a good question. I think there are certainly some plants that are less tolerant, some or animals that are less tolerant. So there are probably organisms that might be able to come in that haven't in the past. Jenny probably knows more about whether there are microbes that would thrive under those conditions. I think the other thing is that the plants we have in Antarctica are very, very adapted to high stress conditions. So if it's very stressful, they have a competitive advantage to other plants that have more productivity, but but are less able to deal with stress.
Mhm.
So if you shift the balance and make it more benign, more easy for everything to grow, then I suspect other plants will come in and outcompete the plants that are really stress tolerant. And I think that's the thing that's going to happen.
Okay.
So like in Patagonia, you have more vascular plants. So there are shrubs and there are grasses. And if once they start growing well, they grow over the moss, and then the moss doesn't have enough light. So I think it's probably that improving conditions generally for growth and plants, and also for other organisms, will mean that other weedy things come in and can grow faster and bigger and outcompete.
Okay.
Yeah.
So sometimes plants get this advantage when they have this way of sensing UV and producing some compounds that allow other stresses.
Most, Gustavo probably knows more about this than me, but most of the compounds that the plants use to protect themselves from UV also help them with desiccation stress or cold stress. So it's more that they produce a suite of compounds, and they might be antioxidants, they might be proteins, enzymes. So there are a whole range of compounds that the plants can produce, and they would protect if it was desiccating or desiccation or freezing or UV, but they cost some energy to make. And so it's that cost of making protection versus just growing as fast as you can. And often the wild ancestors of a crop plant will have better tolerance of desiccation. Like we have bred crops so that we can give them fertilizer and grow them with lots of water. But the ancient ancestors of those plants were better at cold stress or better at water stress, because they had to cope with droughts, whereas now on a farm, we give them the best conditions. And so some plants potentially have forgotten, not literally, but no longer have that ability, because we've bred it out of them to make them grow the biggest that they can. And so it's one of the reasons why people are looking at ancient lines of plants to bring back the potential to cope with drought, now that we have climate change and potentially higher UV. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry. I have another question, more biochemical, regarding the compounds that are protecting these organisms. And I'm not talking only about plants, or if you can only refer to plants. My question is, are the biochemicals or the compounds that are UV protectives similar from plant to moss to lichens, or they are structurally different? And how are they in terms of level of protection?
That's a great question. I'm not sure I know it. Yeah. So different groups of organisms have different compounds. So the plants tend to produce flavonoids.
Yes.
They also tend to have quite a lot of carotenoids.
Yes.
Carotenoids have many, many roles. So some of those are protective, but not all of them. And I don't know how many, I don't know the extent to which they're really protective against UV, but certainly carotenoids, say, is something that both algae and plants have. But then the algae have things like microsporin amino acids. So in the corals and the single-celled algae, you have a different type of compound that you don't see in the plants. Mosses are actually interesting because they retain some of the algal protection, and they have the ones that higher plants have. So they have sort of like doubled up on some of the protection, which I think is really interesting, that they haven't lost the algal ones. And then animals obviously have melanin, and I think fungi also use melanin, do they?
Yes,
Yeah. So it depends, there are many ways that organisms adapted to land by producing various sorts of sunscreen compounds. And I think some of them are really just a screen for UV, whereas the plant ones, I think, are multifunctional. So I don't think the plants necessarily produce them for sunscreens. They produce them so that they can cope with desiccation and
Yes.
UV and cold stress. And whenever we try to make them make those compounds, you have to really stress them for them to start producing them new amounts. So to me, that says that they're multifunctional and they can use them for multiple stresses. And they don't just have a UV screen. So it's a very interesting area in a biochemical sense. And some, obviously, if you have an amino acid compound, it has nitrogen in, whereas the plant compounds tend to be mostly carbon based. So they're cheap compounds to produce.
That is really interesting, particularly in the behavior of plants and the biochemicals that they are producing, just because what you're saying, that is a multi-purpose function against different type of stresses that they will be confronted. So it is a really interesting line of research.
And I don't know do microbes have multi
Yes, they do.
Stress compounds as well?
Yes, they do. Not similar to the ones you have mentioned. Some of microbes have carotenoids and biochemicals from the same family, but they have other type of defenses that have to do particularly with the structure, with the biochemical structure or 3D structure that their proteins and compounds may have, more than really producing a specific compounds. Some pigments, not because the pigments are also present.
One more question? No? Okay, Sharon, thank you very much again for this very interesting talk. Always we learn new things about your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Gustavo. Which?
Yeah.